I start on one basic premise, is that architecture is a secondary or tertiary activity after social, political and economic change.
So basic fundamental premise is very simple, is that architects and urban designers are not primary people who change things primarily. It's social, political and economic change. We're not quite as important as we think we are. And it would follow that if we're going to understand architecture, you first have to understand social, political and economic conditions. I mean, to me, this is obvious. So we as architects and urban designers, as the title is, we swim in the same tide as the rest of society. Todos vamos con la marea. As regards the end of the 20th century, if that's the case, you have to fix, time doesn't fit exactly calendar years, so you have to take major political and economic events. So I think the long 20th century really kind of ends in 2007, 2008, the Great Depression. And the last quarter begins maybe 68, Nuit de Barricade, or the oil crisis of 73 and 79. Well, I'll get back to those later. But a quick review now of the mid-century, post-war mid-century. I mean, classicism really, the remnants of it really died out round about 1960. And then in the post-war period, everyone wanted to make a better world than had existed in the Depression and the nationalism that led to the Second World War. And modernism was the perfect medium for describing that difference amongst architects. Largely stimulated by the United States, it was the golden era of consumerism in the United States, and Europe, certainly Western Europe, was stimulated by the Marshall Plan. So this was what we'd really call the post-war consensus. This ended in quite dramatically in the 1970s. There's not really time to go into the detail of what happened in the 1970s, but if you lived through it, it was pretty awful. I'll list a few things. Nuit de Barricade, domestic terrorism, the Brigate Rosse, the Bader-Meinhof gang, three recessions based on oil, Vietnam War, Watergate. I can go on actually. But it was also the end of the Bretton Woods Agreement, the international monetary agreement that stabilized economies in the West. And this is really, in my opinion, we talk about the beginning. Now, of course, this will have an architectural effect. As I say, this is the end of everyone basically moving in the same direction. But the first thing that really started to affect architecture was the preservation or conservation movement. Really by the 60s and 70s, people have begun to realize the destructive aspects of modernist architecture and planning. And it first of all was felt in historic areas. UNESCO published in 1972 the World Heritage Convention. The impact on that architecturally was what was called neo-vernacular. These are buildings both in the mid-70s. Not strictly speaking classical, but this was called actually by Charles Jenks, and actually other people before that, neo-vernacular. And it was the first really to break the modernist stranglehold. This is Mayfair in London, it's 1975, and this is Troyes in France. I've never found out who actually designed this. I've tried really hard, if someone can tell me. That was later. So that was really the first thing that broke the stranglehold. But the next thing is, this is two critical works. David Watkins' Morality in Architecture and Charles Jenks' Postmodern Architecture. Charles Jenks really was the person that promoted the concept of postmodernism. Interestingly though, there was very little classicism taking place at this time, and we have here Erith and Terry in Britain, or Sweri in France, but really there was very little. I mean, David Watkin really didn't recognize did see any light on the horizon. He didn't see anything good coming out. And Charles Jenks actually really, in his book on postmodernism, describes what straight revivalism is a sort of a minor part of what he regarded in 1977 as postmodernism. So, there was classical architecture, but frankly, very little. But this is the key moment now. Now we enter a new era. First of all, inflation. 13.5% in 1980. Actually, in some countries, it was 20%. And then you've got Reaganomics, and monetarism, which is basically the state control of money supply. This is adopted not just by Reagan, this was actually by Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister, was enthusiastic about this. Japan, other countries took on monetarism. And so what we got was the age of excess. So this is what's his name now? I've forgotten from, that's right, it's Gordon Gekko in the film Wall Street said greed is good. Then the yuppies were invented. For those that don't know what yuppies were, they were young, upwardly mobile professionals, and everyone carried very big phones. Just so that you understand the context of the time, I was in my 30s, usually wore a suit, and if I walked around one of these phones in the street, people would come up to me and say, "You fucking yuppie." So we were not popular. But it was an age of excess, and in here the Tejero coup d'etat failed, and you entered la movida madrileña. So this was an important decade. Symbolized quite well by Madonna, who constantly shifted her identities, and she said what I sang was absolutely ambiguous. I can go on about the social effects of this, but it's a very important period. What happened, though, in architecture was, I think, it was it's already been mentioned, the Strada Novissima, which I haven't illustrated here. Charles Jenks, who was really the major historian of the period, was actually quite surprised by Strada Novissima was not just classical architects. It was a great mix, but in a way, the best way to contradict modernism was through classicism. And so what I've shown here are what Michael Grace, Philip Johnson, and Ricardo Bofill were doing just before they did these. If you were a significant architect at that time, you would have been working in the 90s. You would have been working in the 70s. But particularly the Portland building and the AT&T building, these are widely published even before they were built. But sorry, I've covered up my thing here. But postmodernism has got a bad name. It was regarded as frivolous and shallow. But it's fair to say that these architects here, John Outram or Venturi or Tom Beebe, these were serious architects. They weren't being frivolous and shallow. They genuinely believed that they were actually moving architecture forward, and classical architecture forward. Now, I make no personal judgment on these, but we know that that's what these people considered they were doing. At the same time, this opened up a cultural space, if you like, for new classicism, what we now know as new classicism. And really a number of firms, myself, Dimitri Porphyrios, Enrique Calais Salonia, etc., John Simpson, they all started their practice. These were people born after the war. They all started their practice about this time. And most of these architects represent still to this day, if you like, the solid mass of traditional architecture which carried on, which I will get to. And the work of these architects, at the time, it was considered really part of the postmodernist movement. Generally speaking, these were considered to be part of the postmodernist movement. So really at this point, really under the shadow, if you like, of postmodernism, classicism, a number of people became classicists. The other important thing that happened was basically these two major urban projects. seaside in Florida. I've specifically showed, I think Andres will confirm this or otherwise, the first house in Seaside, and actually some of the center, not specifically classical at all. But the idea that they would become more classical as time went on, as generally was. Here we just showed Leo Creer's house and some of the later building. And Poundbury. Now, Poundbury was very specifically classical from the beginning. So these were two very important urban events that had an architectural impact. So, moving rapidly on, as one must, the next thing that happened was the 1992 recession. This had a major impact on the building industry. I mean, certainly in Britain, architects were the largest unemployed group. And this really quite drastic recession, I mean, there were multiple reasons I haven't got time to go into now. It was blamed, the profligacy, the excess of the 1980s, they were blamed for this recession. So what happened was that everything that happened up to that period, in the 1980s, was regarded negatively. And here we have commercial firms, Chapman Taylor in Britain and SOM, what they were doing in the 70s, what they were doing in the 80s, and then in the 90s they returned to mother modernism. So, but other important things happened at this time. These are really key events. The fall of the Berlin Wall, the liberation of Eastern Europe, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the liberalization of the Indian economy, and the reopening of the Shanghai Stock Exchange. What this did was to globalize capital. And the consequence of that was a huge bonus for modernism, because all these cities around the world wanted to appear to look like modern financial centers. And it was called a homogenization of place. This is a very significant event. What are those two? I knew somebody was going to ask me that, I can't remember. The whole point is I can't tell the difference. That's the point. That's the point. However, at this time, classicism started to consolidate as a movement. These are various books that came out. The middle one's mine. You can't buy it, it's out of print. But really towards the end of the 90s, classicism began to solidify as a movement. And also institutionally. I mean, as Andres is here, to be very clear, that CNU was not a classicist movement, but it was one of the, if you like, one of the directions of a greater respect for tradition. Thomas Gordon Smith became the dean of Notre Dame School. The Prince of Wales opened up his institute, and that had teaching associated with that. And classicism continued, but it became less inventive. I think this is the negative side, if you like, of what happened with the discrediting of postmodernism. I mean, all of these are inventive in their own way, but they returned to much more orthodox classicism. The inventive impulse was slightly lost. It did survive in rare cases, interestingly, more often with institutional and commercial buildings, where the pressures were rather different. See with Dimitri, one of my own buildings, and Ramza. But I think we have to remember also at this period, there were still very few classical architects practicing. This is the foundation of INTBAU. It's a global organization. At that time, it had 6 chapters and very few members. I mean, now it's got 40 chapters and 10,000 members. And David Watkin rewrote Morality in Architecture Revisited. He was not very optimistic at the end, I have to say, although he did identify that there were, I think, 15 classical architects practicing. So still at this time, there were very few classical architects practicing. But I think, as I'm going to conclude, as I must, certain things happened at this period, in this period, which are indicators, if you like, for what was going to happen. And so I call these pointers for the future, as we take ourselves beyond this recession. One of them was the conflation of the vernacular and the classical. Because don't forget that the homogenization of place was really regarded very negatively. And so the idea that you could actually combine the classical with the vernacular, which represented the local, the meaning of vernacular to some extent changed. So here we have Leo Creer and Choice and Fate in 1998, and Roger Scruton publishing the classical vernacular at the same period. The other thing that happened, and I have to be slightly careful with this one now, because but the internationalization of globalization was regarded very negatively. There were anti-globalization demonstrations, but one of the effects is the growth of populism. Now, as we're a room of university-educated, often multilinguistic people, we will not really like this very much. However, this is something that's changed the political and social landscape, and we ignore it at our peril. It's not all bad, but this takes us to the other side of the recession, and this is where it ends. This is where my long 20th century ends. This actually starts to end the dominance of globalization. It'll never disappear completely. So it's the end of globalization. It's also the end of the long 20th century, and it's also the end of this lecture. So thank you very much.